Letters in the genome are incorporated into multiple messages. These are essentially the instructions for building and operating a living organism. A single sequence of DNA, ATCG, would be your DNA letters, your nucleotides. A single sequence of DNA can be read in different ways to produce different proteins. And we're supposed to believe that this all evolved randomly over time for no reason at all. We write books that can be read forwards. DNA can be read both forwards and backwards. And every other DNA letter, you could have another message encoded. What that means is DNA is actually polyconstrained and polyfunctional. Why it's polyconstrained is because if you get a deleterious mutation in a sequence that has multiple messages, you're not just messing up one message, you're messing up multiple messages.
Hey, welcome back to Campfire Apologetics, where I help give the everyday Christian tools to help defend their faith in a hostile culture. I'm Mark Hudson, and today I am joined by Donny Budinsky and Matt Nailor, who says that he is Donny's shadow. And they are both a wealth of information when it comes to young Earth creation and the topic of Adam and Eve, and probably a lot of other things. But today, that's going to be the topic. Is Donny's going to be talking a bit about young Earth creation, and I think Matt's going to take over and talk a bit about Adam and Eve. And so I'll turn it over to you guys, and I will let you kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your channel. Where can we find you? What's your website? Anything else that you want us to know about you, you know, if pineapple goes on pizza or anything like that. And then we'll get going. So, yeah, welcome.
Well, my wife makes really good homemade pizza. And last night we did have pizza with, believe it or not, some pineapple on it. So,
nice.
Okay.
Amen. Amen.
Hey, there we go. Okay. So we're in agreement there. We like pineapple on pizza. Good. And so, Mark, it is a privilege to be here with you, brother, on your ministry channel, Campfire Apologetics. You yourself are doing great work. I've gone through a lot of your material and content. You've had some excellent guests on, and you run a professional program. And so it is a privilege to be here. Mark, Matt and I are excited. We've been researching these topics basically full time now for many years. And you can find our ministry channel on YouTube. We have a primary channel and a secondary channel. Primary channel is Standing for Truth. And then our secondary channel is Young Earth Creation, where we re-upload a lot of the content, put some new content as well. On the main channel, I also host debates. I've hosted probably now close to 450 debates on all sorts of topics, including the Trinity and just all things theology, soteriology, eschatology. So if your audience are into those kinds of debates, do make sure to subscribe to the main channel, Standing for Truth, to check those out. And we focus primarily in terms of our research on young Earth creation, biblical creation, origins in general. And we've got several active research projects where we seek to answer the question of ancestry. That involves providing scientific evidence for Adam and Eve. Matt, he does a lot of the editing and behind the scenes work. And so without Matt, I don't know where I'd be or what I'd be doing. He's a hard worker, and he does a great job at what he does. And so today we are going to present some of that evidence. We're excited for it.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. Matt, did you want to say anything, or are you going to let Donny take the reins there?
No, that was pretty good. Yeah, he mentioned my channel, Young Earth Creation. That was the backup channel in case his ever had a problem, because as you know, critics out there hate our work. They attack us. They attack you personally. They try to get your content taken down. Yeah. And it was just a second backup case scenario in case everything happened. Luckily, nothing ever has, but you just never know.
This is true. This is true. Like I said, I don't think I've ever received a positive comment on TikTok. So I'm with you. You're always being attacked. And yeah, you know you're wrong when you're told you're a big doo-doo head, right? So
right. Yeah.
That's usually the defining moment where you're like, oh, you know what? He's right.
If
He
that's the
got me.
response, name calling, which we get a lot of every single video. And I like to say every comment that we get that's anti-creation or anti our ministry, it increases our power levels
Yeah.
by a point. And so we love it. We love our critics. They're good for business as well. Mark, you put out a video, let's say on Twitter or YouTube, and you get flooded with comments. That's good for the algorithm, isn't that?
It is. It helps. It helps. It brings more people to the channel. So, hey, keep doing it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Awesome. So, Donny, right, you're going to be taking over first with your presentation here. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll be giving the first roughly half of the talk, and then we're going to hand it over to Matt. We do like visuals. We know that a lot of people are visual learners, so I've got quite a few slides and visuals, and then Matt, the same thing. So we've got a lot to present for your audience, Mark.
Cool.
And I'll take the first half.
All right, let me go ahead and bring you up here. Awesome. Is that good? Is that big enough for you, or how's that look?
Yes, and I can put this full screen. Let me know if it works from current slide.
Okay.
I can press hide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Looks good. Looks good to me.
If that looks good, then I think we're basically ready to go.
Cool, man.
And Mark, you can see me on I'm guessing on the top. I can't see anything but my slides, but I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, no, you're in there. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Let's have some fun, gentlemen. Sit back, relax. Feel free to mute yourselves if you'd like to. We're going to be here for a while because it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. We are in many ways overwhelmed with evidence. Every time Matt and I put on a talk, which we've given several this summer, we always look forward to these. It's hard to pick which lines of evidence we are going to focus on. Because, Mark, if we were to go with all of the incredible evidence for biblical creation and a literal Adam and Eve, we'd be here easily until same time next week. And so for this talk, I've picked several that I know are undeniable and irrefutable. And so we are going to focus on those as we dismantle evolution and confirm creation. And so this is a presentation by myself, Donny Budinsky, and Matt Nailor, Stand for Truth Ministries. You can find our website there, standfortruthministries.com. We've got endless content there on just about every topic. I like to start our talks by going over a couple mottos, but also scriptural passages. 1 Corinthians 2:5 comes to mind. That your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Man is fallible. They have a lot of ideas. They have an interesting imagination, as we are going to see here today. They have a lot of wild ideas on the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of biodiversity. And we are going to see that those ideas are in many ways contrary to what the scripture says. Good science always upholds God's word. And so we are going to see that real empirical science upholds or confirms what the Bible says about origins. Here's the ministry website, standfortruthministries.com. We've got articles, videos, all kinds of resources for people. If you go to the main page, the home page, and scroll down just a little bit and look to the right, you'll see an answering challenges section. And what I've done there was added in a lot of your common challenges or objections that critics have. And you can click those links and you'll find either a video or an article response of some kind. We've written and published several books on the topic of origins and outside of origins as well. I've written a book on eschatology, and this specifically being a presentation on origins. I've got a couple here to showcase special creation. A lot of what I'm going to be discussing in this presentation you can find in the special creation book. I go into the scientific evidence for the biblical Eve, the biblical Adam, Y chromosome Noah, to be specific, would be our last universal Y chromosomal ancestor. We'll get into that. We get into the hominin, the so-called hominin fossil record with Neanderthals and human evolution. This book, I discuss junk DNA and the best so-called evidence for evolution, such as the chromosome 2 fusion and endogenous retroviruses. If you do a little research on the internet and Google or check on YouTube, what's the best evidence for evolution or common descent? Typically what comes up is endogenous retroviruses. They are overconfident on this argument. And I've even heard evolutionists say that you can't prove things in science, which is true. It's about disproving. And they've said that endogenous retroviruses, which are basically these shared viral-like sequences in the biological world, they say that's as close to proof as you can get. And so my mindset has been over the years, let's look at what the best they have to offer. I want to see what are their best arguments, what are their best lines of evidence, and then deal with those. Because if you can show that their best supposed evidence for evolution is false, then what does that do about their lesser used or less prominent pieces of evidence? And so I wrote an entire book dealing with the topic of endogenous retroviruses, dismantling the best evidence for common descent. It's available on Amazon. You can check that out. I've also done several debates with prominent evolutionists on the topic of endogenous retroviruses. Formal debate-wise, I've had close to 100. And Matt and I just recently did a debate seminar with Culture Cats on Adam, Eve, and biblical creationists. He's a popular evolutionist on YouTube. He's a skilled debater, and so we were thrilled to have that opportunity to defend biblical creation against him. And so for those wondering how a critic or skeptic might respond to a lot of what we're saying here tonight, you can check out that debate. It's comprehensive, and we're very happy with it. Here's a couple articles that I recommend. This is an article that I co-authored, and got published with Chris Root. This one focused on genetic entropy. Genetic entropy is basically the idea that the majority of mutations are deleterious. They're damaging, disease-causing. Mutations are supposed to be the engine of evolutionary change. But it turns out that the majority of them are low impact. Selection can't see the majority of them. They build up over time. They lead to genetic sickness. It's much like rust on a car. Rust slowly builds up over time. Each single rust molecule on its own in many ways is inconsequential. Like a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. You could still read a book. You can still read a book the size of the encyclopedia, let's say The Lord of the Rings, with spelling mistakes. But over time, they accumulate, and now the book becomes unreadable. It becomes a mess. In the same way that rust builds up on a car over time, you can still drive the car for a while. It goes unnoticed, but eventually it does build up to the point where the car degenerates and you need a new one. And that's what we see in living organisms. And so Dr. John Sanford, he's the author of Genetic Entropy. He came up with the name genetic entropy, although you can find the concept, the idea of genetic degeneration in general. You can find that all throughout the conventional literature. And so we had the honor of having Dr. Sanford peer review our article here on genetic entropy, showing that, and this gets a little technical, so for those that want the details, I recommend checking out the article. It did go through a rigorous review process, but there's something called genetic fixation, where we have the nearly neutral mutation rate. And this is even according to evolutionary population geneticists and evolutionary scientists. For example, Fatuma, who's well known in the world of evolution, they agree that the nearly neutral mutation rate, the observed mutation rate, approximates the fixation rate. Fixation just means to be stuck in place. And so if that's true in evolutionary time, and the majority of nearly neutral mutations are deleterious, that's damage being stuck in place population-wide. Evolutionists can't deal with it. They've attempted, but it really is a point that falsifies the theory. We've also got a couple articles here overturning the so-called human chromosome 2 fusion. That is another argument that is featured heavily by evolutionists as being some of the best evidence for evolution, that supposedly after the hypothetical split, humans and chimps, according to the model, can be traced back to a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago. We as humans have 46 chromosomes. The great apes, like chimpanzees, they're a great ape, they have 48 chromosomes. Well, there's a discrepancy right there. So the evolutionists say, well, there must have been a fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes, which is why we now as humans have 46 rather than 48. And so we have some findings here where we've discovered very similar signatures that you find in the human chromosome 2 that evolutionists argue that's why there's a fusion. The supposed telomeric repeats in chromosome fusion 2. But we found similar signatures in other chromosomes, for example, the chromosome 9, and nobody would say that those chromosomes are the result of a fusion. And so very interesting research. You can read those details in at least one of these articles. But one thing I do want to say as I move on is we are going to see that a lot of the evidence that evolutionists use for common descent, it's what's called agnostic or non-discriminatory evidence. What that means is it doesn't really do much to advance the debate because both models can explain the data. When it comes to the fusion, they agree. They admit that the fusion would have occurred in the human line after the hypothetical split. Okay, so as creationists, we actually have a couple bottlenecks. We have a bottleneck at the flood where the human population restarts with 8 people. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. And so there's a bottleneck. We also have a bottleneck in many ways at the Tower of Babel before people spread out to all parts of the globe. And so that offers enough time for a fusion, a unilateral mistake like that to become fixed. But the evolutionary model, they really struggle because if there was a fusion, this unilateral mistake, then what that means is that would have been a near extinction event. That person with the fusion, experiencing the fusion, they'd be the sole ancestor of every single person on the planet. Where's the subgroups of people with 48 chromosomes? They don't exist. Every single human has 46. That signature has been fixed. In the evolutionary model, that means all people outside of those with the 46 chromosomes, they'd have to be wiped out. Those lineages would have to be wiped out, those tribes, in order for that so-called fusion to become prominent, to become fixed. And so creationists, even with that point, have the better explanation. Again, here's a debate we did with Culture Cats. And as you can tell already, we are going to be discussing a lot of genetics. And the genetic data can be technical. And so I want to make sure that we are all on the same page as we continue moving forward here. And so I want to go over some basics. And right here is a picture of the human genome. You can see pairs of chromosomes. For example, chromosome 1, you've got one chromosome 1 and a second chromosome 1. Same thing with 2, 3, 4. Why that is because we inherit one chromosome from our mom and one from our dad. Basically 50% DNA from both parents. We also experience what's called recombination. That's where the chromosomes line up and essentially exchange genetic information. That way you get novel chromosomal combinations every generation. That's why hypothetically a husband and a wife could have 1 million kids and every single kid would be different because there's built-in what's called heterozygosity, DNA diversity. And so this is what's called autosomal biparentally inherited nuclear DNA. Now, what is the genome exactly? Well, the genome is all of your DNA. It is essentially the complete set of genetic instructions that a biological organism uses to develop and to function. You'll notice down here, though, you've got the X and the Y, and then you've got XX. So if you're XX, you'd be a woman. If you're XY, you would be a man. And something like the Y chromosome, it would be considered nuclear DNA because it's within the nucleus of the cell, but it's non-recombining because it doesn't have a chromosomal counterpart. although there is some data suggesting there might be some recombination or gene conversion at the tips, but for the most part, non-recombining. Now, God is an amazing engineer. Incredibly, you have 6 feet of DNA in every single one of your cells. God is an amazing packaging engineer. If life were simple, evolution might have a chance. Unfortunately, for naturalistic evolutionists, life is not simple. Life is incredibly complex. Notice this visual. A human cell contains 6 feet of DNA if all the DNA molecules were stretched out end to end. This is all packaged and organized into chromosomes that fit nicely into the tiny cell nucleus. Letters in the genome are incorporated into multiple messages. These are essentially the instructions for building and operating a living organism. A single sequence of DNA, ATCG, would be your DNA letters, your nucleotides. A single sequence of DNA can be read in different ways to produce different proteins. And we're supposed to believe that this all evolved randomly over time for no reason at all. We write books that can be read forwards. DNA can be read both forwards and backwards, and every other DNA letter, you could have another message encoded. What that means is DNA is actually polyconstrained and polyfunctional. Why it's polyconstrained is because if you get a deleterious mutation in a sequence that has multiple messages, you're not just messing up one message, you're messing up multiple messages. There is a lot of information packed into these DNA sequences. Mutually interdependent systems. It's very entertaining, especially in debates, to bring up what's called mutually interdependent systems. There's many that we can focus on. For sake of time, I'll go over one here and see how the evolutionists struggle. That's when you really see the storytelling come out, the imagination. And what a mutually interdependent system is basically these systems that have to come in together at the same time to be working, to be functioning. One example is DNA and DNA repair enzymes. It has been said that in a single day in a single cell, you could experience up to 1 million DNA breaks. We have 60 to 65 trillion cells. Think about that. 1 million DNA breaks in a single cell in a single day. Those are a lot of DNA lesions. That's a lot of DNA mistakes. Thank God we are engineered amazingly with these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of these DNA breaks. If we didn't have these, we'd go extinct in just a couple generations. Now, they don't work perfectly because, as I briefly touched on earlier, we do have mutation accumulation. And the germ cell mutation rate in autosomal nuclear DNA is roughly 100 per person per generation. And so they don't do their job perfectly. But if they weren't there, there'd be many thousands more mutations happening that aren't being fixed. Well, it turns out that DNA repair enzymes are encoded in the DNA, the information for them. Well, wait a minute. What came first, DNA or DNA repair enzymes? If you have DNA but no DNA repair enzymes, then what are going to fix all of those DNA lesions? If you have DNA repair enzymes but no DNA, what's encoding for the information for the DNA repair enzymes? You see the problem? You need both coming into existence at the exact same time. What does the Bible say in Genesis? God created everything, and it was very good. Life did not evolve through evolutionary processes such as selection and mutation and other naturalistic means. That's just one of the many chicken and egg problems that evolutionists have to deal with. And their answers are always stories or appealing to the unobserved past. Well, we must have had proto-cells millions to billions of years ago, and maybe they didn't need the kind of sophisticated DNA repair enzymes that we see today. You'll ask them to show you the proto-cell. Oh, we don't have those. So it's a lot of imagination, which is why this slide is important, because there's a bait and switch, gentlemen. Oftentimes you'll have evolutionists say, what, you deny evolution? You don't believe in evolution? Well, it depends what you mean by evolution. If what you mean by evolution is change over time, or in technical terms, changes in allele frequencies in populations over generations, allele meaning a genetic variant. And so the frequency that you'll find those genetic variants in populations, then we're not going to have an issue. If by evolution you mean domestic dogs, wolves, and coyotes are related, then again, we're not going to have an issue. That can be demonstrated empirically. But if by evolution, which is what they actually mean by evolution, they may say change over time, but what they mean is large scale evolution, fish to fisherman evolution. This idea that not only are domestic dogs and wolves related, but it's that domestic dogs, wolves, and banana plants are related, or mosquitoes. That's where we have the issue, because that's where the evidence lacks for such an idea, which is why it's important to have an overview of the evolutionary and biblical creation models. This right here is a sophisticated phylogenetic tree of life. Notice the source, we are related to everything. So evolutionists believe that everything, including bacteria, you as a human, a frog, a banana plant, go back to a single common ancestor. Here's another evolutionary tree where you got fish, bacteria, humans, whales, all related through common ancestry. What the evidence supports and what we hold to here is the separate ancestry model. And so rather than all life being related through common ancestry, we believe and we argue for separate ancestry, independent origins. That would suggest, and you can see here on the visual, that, for example, humans, based on the Bible in Genesis, which is supported by scientific evidence, God creates two people, Adam and Eve, separate from any other form of life, including banana plants and apes. Okay? He creates Adam from the dust of the ground, Eve from his rib, and separate from any other form of life. Jesus refers back to Adam and Eve. He says from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. That means Jesus was a creationist. From the beginning of creation, he made them male and female, referring back to creation week, specifically day 6. And so we would start from that position, and we have plenty of scientific lines of evidence supporting that. Fish to fisherman evolution is a fairy tale. They will appeal to time and mutations and selection, but mutations being supposedly the driving force of evolutionary change, the majority of mutations are nearly neutral. Selection can't see them. They're invisible to selection. You'll hear that a lot from evolutionists. It's just a fine-tuning mechanism that keeps a species as strong as it can be. It doesn't add anything new. It doesn't create anything. It's not going to take bacteria-like organisms into biologists over time. It's just not possible. And then they say, well, mutations add the necessary genetic variation for selection to act upon, to select for, to drive evolution. But mutations, for the most part, they are deleterious. They are disease-causing. They're damaging. They're not moving things forward. At best, you get what's called horizontal changes, not vertical changes. And so more time means more extinction, more degeneration, not common descent or descent with modification. This is a very important point that I want people to consider and understand. The evolution and creation models have a lot of overlap. Now, what this means is, and I briefly touched on it earlier, there is what's called agnostic evidence and discriminating evidence. Now, what that means is, let's say I were arguing for creation with an evolutionist, and I said creation's true because the sky is blue, or creation is true because the earth is round. Okay, the flat earthers might disagree with that, but okay, so if the earth is round, they would say no, because evolution can also explain why the sky is blue or the earth is round. These are observations that are agnostic to the overall debate. Both models, as a matter of fact, many different models can account for that data. What is most important, what we need to focus on, are lines of evidence that can help discriminate between the models, where only one model, let's say creation, can explain the data and evolution can't. A piece of evidence that precludes one of the models, making it essentially impossible. If the multiverse were true, People that like Marvel, DC comics. Let's say the multiverse were true. You had Earth 1 and Earth 2. Okay, let's say in Earth 2, evolution's true. In Earth 1, creation's true. Okay, you'd have certain observations that even in Earth 2, where apparently evolution's true, creation could also account for the data. And the same thing applies to Earth 1. And here are some agnostic lines of evidence, and then I want to cover some discriminatory evidence where only creation can account for the data, and you guys are going to be mind blown. This data is fascinating. Evolutionists can't deal with it. For now, agnostic evidence, where if you had Earth 1 and Earth 2, the same observations, both models would be able to account for the data, even if on one Earth evolution is true, on another Earth creation is true, okay? Homology, classification, nested hierarchies, and so-called transitional forms. Let's briefly cover these. So when it comes to homology, these shared structures that you see in the biological world, right here, for example, comparative anatomy. You also have homology in genetics, okay? Well, our model says this. We start with Genesis. God creates man in his own image. That must mean there's something about us that reflects the divine. Exactly what that is debated. There's some in-house debate, but in its most basic form, there must be something about us that reflects the divine. Therefore, when it comes to creation, evolution, origins, and ancestry, perhaps we can get an idea into how God created based on the way we as human engineers design and build things. Well, it turns out that human engineers design in homologous patterns. So sure, you might see homologous patterns in the biological world that evolutionists interpret as being the result of descent with modification, that these structures were inherited from past common ancestors and they were modified over time. Okay. They may interpret it that way. But if I were to look to the design world, take modes of transportation, for example. You have vehicles that are made in North America, that are made in Europe, and that are made in any continent. You can pick a different continent, okay? And let's say Asia. And those vehicles are going to have a lot of similarities, okay? Similarities in, let's say, the tires, the engines. They'll be designed or built from a certain length from the ground, okay? Now, were those features inherited from a common Arctic ancestor? No, it's good design. Okay. And so human engineers design in homologous patterns. Why shouldn't God? And that's where we see all these modes of vehicles, even from different manufacturing companies. A lot of similarities, homologous patterns. So creationists would look to common design. Classification. Okay. Evolutionists spend a lot of time. You're probably familiar with Linnaeus classification, taxonomy, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, evolutionists would classify, taxonomists would classify humans in with great apes based on certain characteristics, and classify humans and the great apes as primates, and all of primates as mammals, and so on and so forth. So you have these classification schemes. But chimpanzees don't care how you classify them. Frogs don't care how you classify them. We like to do that. We like to classify things. If you were to go to my book collection here, I could go look at Mark's book collection. They're probably, as I know mine are, largely organized or classified into different sections. Theology books over here, soteriology books over here, end times books over here, creation, science books over here, secular books in one location. And so we like to organize things. And yes, the biological world is orderly, and we can look to different features and traits and categorize creatures based on those. And if you draw a circle big enough or make a category that incorporates a lot of different things, then evolutionists can interpret that erroneously to mean, well, all those things must be related. Let's say things are affected by gravity. Okay, well, now you got bowling balls, humans, chairs, frogs. Motorized transportation. Okay, there's a nice category. Now we got boats. We could have airplanes, trucks, motorcycles. How about things that breathe? Again, you make a circle big enough, you're going to have everything in it. Babies, bats, lions, gorillas. And so classification systematics is largely agnostic. to the debate. It's nice to classify things, but it doesn't demonstrate that all those things are related, because you can classify them different ways. Another important point that people don't consider is hard to classify vehicles. And so this goes back to the original image. Evolutionists like to point to what they call transitional forms: Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, mammal-like reptiles, these creatures that basically blend the features of two different kind of creatures. Or they'll say they have a mix, a blending of basal features and more modern features. And we have in the design world vehicles that resist classification. And so man actually designs kinds of vehicles that are more difficult to categorize, that blend the features of different kind of vehicles. For example, we have the invention of crossover SUVs. You got your Jeep Gladiator, your Ford Flex, your Dodge Journey. You don't like an SUV, you don't necessarily want a van. How about something in between? Okay, now it's not that these are the transition between SUVs and vans. It's that they are good design. They serve a purpose. Evolutionists might interpret those as being the perfect transitional form. No, these interesting mosaics that we see in the biological world, they are representative of good design. Plus, if common descent were true and we evolved from fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals to monkeys to man, we should find tens of thousands of intermediates, not just a dozen that we can sit here and debate all day. For example, Tiktaalik claimed to be the famous fishapod. It actually turned out years later, after that discovery, that predating Tiktaalik in Poland, they found tetrapod foot tracks. According to the evolutionary model, if I remember correctly, they predated Tiktaalik, those foot tracks, true tetrapod foot tracks, by about 20 million years. Well, not very good for your evidence for being a transitional form. We even have hard to classify vehicles that no longer exist, because evolutionists, they like to point to the fossil record and say, hey, look at this interesting mosaic or intermediate. We don't have that today, because these transitional forms, populations evolve over time, and you would have that kind of evolutionary advancement taking place where a lot of those so-called transitional forms go extinct. Well, we have the same thing with man-made modes of transportation. This is the 1961 Amphicar. Interesting. The 1970 Bond Bug. Again, hard to classify vehicles. The military has even recognized the good design of these so-called transitional-like vehicles. You have the military amphibious assault vehicle, built for the transitional environment between sea and land. So a boat is a great design, but not necessarily good on the land, is it? A tank, great for the land, not necessarily good in the sea. But the military has invented military amphibious assault vehicles where they're perfect for that transitional environment between sea and land. Evolutionary logic and thinking is, okay, take that military amphibious assault vehicle, put it right in between a ship and a tank, and there's your sequence of evolutionary change. Lining things up doesn't prove fish to fisherman evolution. You could have a unicycle, a bicycle, and a four-wheeler. Evolutionary thinking is, well, I predict there's going to be a three-wheeler out there, a tricycle. Lo and behold, you find a tricycle in a junkyard somewhere, like digging up a fossil in the ground. Here's the perfect intermediate. No, these are good designs, and just because you can line something up does not demonstrate the validity of your position. And so again, a lot of agnostic lines of evidence where both models can largely account for the data. Now, this is where things get fun and very interesting. We've got discriminatory lines of evidence. I'm going to have a quick drink here. So these are pieces of data points that only the creation model can account for. And I know from experience, because I've had over 100 debates. I've also held open mic debate challenge series where we will do an open mic challenge for 4 or 5, sometimes 6 hours, and allow all evolutionists to join and give their best evidence or refute these points, and they fail over and over again. And so we have the human Y chromosome here. Now, the Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. It's passed down on one side, the father's side. So for example, I have my father's Y chromosome. My 2 sons have mine. Women don't have a Y chromosome. Women are XX. Men are XY. And so it's paternally inherited, and for the most part does not have what's called recombination. Now, because it lacks recombination, the Y chromosome in many ways should be more stable, more similar between humans and chimpanzees. Now, if you look at this visual, we have the human Y and your chimpanzee Y. Notice right off the bat, visually, very different, very different. As a matter of fact, when you consider overall architecture, size differences, and gene content, the human Y and the chimpanzee Y are less than 30% the same. Think about that. We're supposed to go back to a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago here. Yet in the Y chromosome, we're less than 30% the same. Those are massive differences. Notice this. These are all color-coded. This is heterochromatin. That's a fancy word for this type of DNA. It's densely packed. It largely comprises repetitive sequences called satellite DNA, such as satellite DNA. The chimpanzee, where's all the heterochromatin there? It basically lost, according to the evolutionists, it would have lost the entirety of its heterochromatic arm. Your human Y is actually more similar to the gorilla Y. So here's the gorilla Y chromosome. Compare your human and Y and gorilla Ys to the chimpanzee Y. These are more similar to each other than either are to the chimpanzee Y. Well, there's a break in the so-called nested hierarchy, because another argument they like to look to is nested hierarchies. Why are humans overall more similar to chimpanzees than they are to, let's say, monkeys, dogs, and fish? Well, just stand afar. Look at a human, look at a chimpanzee. They look a lot more similar to each other than they do to a dog or a fish. So you'd expect this natural nested hierarchy. In the same way that human engineers design in nested hierarchical patterns where sedans are more similar to hatchbacks than they are to boats or airplanes. You have this natural nested hierarchy. Well, in this specific instance, we have human Y, the human Y and the gorilla Y more similar to each other than to the chimpanzee Y. So how do evolutionists explain those massive differences? This right here, these are excerpts directly from the conventional literature. Notice what they say. Despite a recent divergence of these species, their Y chromosomes differ just a little bit? No, enormously in size and gene content. They're admitting this. Just like I said, you can look at that visual and you can basically interpret it in light of exactly how the conventional literature is explaining things. They say the chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y. That's what we saw there. They say the percentage of gene families shared by these 2 chromosomes that split, they assume the split took place, right? So you're not going to get a paper published in the peer-reviewed literature if you're not assuming evolution, if you don't, at least you can question little details of the evolutionary model, but you can't question the bigger picture. You're not going to get published. 6 million years ago is similar to that shared by human, and look at this, chicken autosomes. So that's your autosomal nuclear DNA, biparentally inherited, a little different than your uniparentally inherited DNA. But this is a significant point because they're saying that is what it is similar to. And humans and chickens, according to evolutionists, they have a common ancestor way back in the past, 310 million years ago, apparently. They also say this, puzzlingly, okay, evolutionists, where did you predict this data? Because they're always admitting in the secular literature that this is a puzzle, this is confusing, surprisingly. Where's the predictions? I thought the gold standard of science is making testable and falsifiable predictions. Yeah, if you throw enough predictions at the wall, 1 or 2 are going to stick here and there. But what about all of the predictions that didn't turn out? Or what about all the data that wasn't predicted and is contrary to the evolutionary model? So they say, puzzlingly, in terms of shared genes and overall architecture, just like my interpretation, the human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. Here's the most up-to-date data. 2024. That was just last year. It's not getting any better for the evolutionists. They've got even more sophisticated sequencing data. of the Y chromosomes, sex chromosomes to be specific, to analyze and compare. Take your human Y here, bring it up to your chimpanzee Y. Just like I said, 26.2%. Guys, that is less than 30% the same. Those are some massive differences. The differences between human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are said to be due to a combination of gene loss, gene gain. Remember, it's much easier to break a gene than build one up. The burden is on the evolutionists to explain how all these genes can be built up through evolutionary processes. For example, we have this essential group of genes called orphan genes. These are taxonomically restricted and essential genes. And they're called orphan genes because they exist in, let's say, humans. You have groups of genes, they're functional, but there's no precursors to where they evolved from. They're just boom, they're there, they're in place, no evidence for evolution. They have the same set of genes, but they're different. They're orphan genes, different kinds in, let's say, chimpanzees and dogs. And so these are orphan genes, okay? And the evolutionists have the burden to explain how those could have originated, how those could have evolved. Notice this. More than 30% of the chimpanzee Y chromosome fails to align to the human Y chromosome. The portion of the Y chromosomes are said to have been rearranged. So they have to invoke a lot of storytelling. Perhaps this portion was rearranged, maybe this, like the heterochromatin was lost. The chimpanzee Y chromosome has twice as many large palindrome sequences. Those are certain sequences that serve to protect important genes in male fertility as the human Y. And so this is a major challenge to evolutionary scientists. And yet we could take every single male human Y chromosome, we can compare them, build family trees, and all of our Y chromosomes are nearly identical. My Y chromosome, Mark's, Matt's, low variation, 99.9% the same, close to that. And they can all be traced back to a single Y chromosomal common ancestor in the not so distant past, about 4,500 years ago. And that's based on the observed mutation rate, which is roughly 1 to 3 per individual. Matt is going to be touching more on that. And so that's biblical time. Just a few DNA differences, low diversity, but yet we have these Y chromosomes that are nearly identical, and the mutation rate is very fast. Okay. Just one second. I'm going to mute real quick because there's a lot of noise coming from upstairs. The joys of having 3 kids. So, okay, let's continue here. We've got Francis Collins, a well-known evolutionary scientist. And he said this. This is a straw man argument. We see this frequently with evolutionists. He says there is no way you can develop this level of variation between us from 1 or 2 ancestors. Well, that assumes that all DNA variation is due to mutations over time. There are 2 very different models or explanations for the origin of genetic diversity or variation over time. Evolutionists look to deleterious mutation accumulation as explaining the majority of DNA variation. Whereas creationists, we look to what's called design diversity. This is in technical terms called the created heterozygosity hypothesis, where Adam and Eve and the created kinds would have been created in a state of DNA diversity. The Bible says, Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Did God want that to be carried out through cloning? Well, of course not. That doesn't make much sense. God's saying be fruitful and multiply. So what makes the most sense theologically and scientifically is that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with pre-existing DNA variation. That way you don't have to explain the origin of DNA variation as being due to mutations over time, which would take millions of years. This is beneficial and useful diversity, front-loaded right at creation, where genetic processes like recombination and gene conversion and environment is good at dictating morphology and bringing about novel phenotypes as well. And so in single generations, just by the shuffling of these pre-existing DNA variants, you can get novel chromosomal combinations quickly, since those DNA variations are already built in. Notice this: the ultimate source of all genetic variation is mutation. That's an evolutionary assumption. So Francis Collins, he's arguing against evolutionary creation. We don't believe that all DNA variation is due to mutations over time. So it doesn't take a long time to build up that DNA variety. And a testable prediction of this model is what? It's DNA function. If created heterozygosity is true, that the original created kinds were designed with pre-existing DNA diversity, we would predict that the majority of the genome is functional. Do we have evidence for this? Yes, indeed we do. Notice this. This is the ENCODE project. These data enabled us to assign biochemical functions for 80% of the genome. Now, evolutionists, they don't tap out. They argue, well, that 80% must be spurious or just noise, not real beneficial activity, because it is biochemical activity. We as creationists would argue that no, we can infer that that's real functional activity, because transcription is an energy-intensive, resource-intensive process. Every time you add a single nucleotide to a growing RNA chain, you're consuming energy, you're consuming ATP. And so if the majority of this activity really were just junk or noise, as evolutionists like to argue, especially militant evolutionists, then evolutionary processes or mechanisms like selection should have weeded out all that junk over time, because that would be wasteful of energy and resources for the cell. And so that strongly suggests that this 80% activity is legit activity, which means if the majority of the genome is functional, that's not only testimony to the validity of the design diversity hypothesis, it makes the genetic entropy problem worse, because now you have a mutation rate of 100 new mutations per person per generation that are hitting spots of the genome that are not strictly neutral, they're nearly neutral. And that means degeneration is going to happen a lot more quickly than evolutionists would like to admit. Notice this directly from the BioLogos website. What is the genetic evidence for human evolution? They point to what's called genetic scars or pseudogenes, these so-called shared genetic mistakes between humans and chimpanzees. They say that a mistake or mutation would have occurred, and then it would have been passed on after the split, which is why humans share these specific pseudogenes, and then chimpanzees share the same. Okay. Well, here's the problem is they assume these are pseudogenes. They assume incorrectly that these are genetic scars or genetic mistakes. Notice this. We have paper after paper demonstrating and documenting the amazing functional roles of these so-called pseudogenes. Remember, these genes, these functional DNA elements, did not name themselves pseudogenes. Okay. They are necessary to sustain healthy life processes. There's many functions we can go over. I have an entire debunking junk DNA presentation where I spend a lot of time on these points. We're just moving through them quickly. One function is your pseudogene actually regulates the protein coding counterpart, which is one of the reasons why they got to look like their protein coding counterpart. Another argument, endogenous retroviruses. They assume ERVs are the ancient remnants of past viral infections. The question is this, gentlemen. Are these really created units of DNA function, or are they created units of DNA function, or are they the ancient vestiges or ancient remnants of past viral infections? Well, the evidence suggests directly in the conventional literature that they're created units of DNA function. ERVs are playing an antiviral role in the genome. These designed ERVs, they actually work to fight off exogenous retroviruses and harmful viruses. And the design of the ERV, the way that they look, they're structured with LTRs, GAGPOL, ENV components. They have to look that way to carry out their operational roles, because evolutionists will oftentimes argue or ask the question, well, why do ERVs look like retroviruses if they didn't come from retroviruses? Well, they have to look that way to carry out their functions. They also function in determining cell types and regulating gene expression. Notice this one. ERVs are essential in regulating early stages of human embryonic development. I've got a whole hour-plus long presentation on ERVs. I've done whole debates on it where I go over the dozens of papers associated with ERV function. There's one paper that says if we didn't have ERVs, we wouldn't exist. Mammals wouldn't exist because they're necessary for embryological development. And this is why the biblical model of human origins is best supported by the data. Now, here's the last section that I am going to present on. Then we are going to hand it off to Matt. And so it's interesting because evolutionists, they require deep time. They require millions and billions of years to take fish to fishermen, to take goo to the zoo to you. If they only had thousands of years, well, then evolution's impossible. Now, I would argue even if you had trillions of years, evolution would be impossible because the drivers of evolutionary change are contrary to the type of changes you'd need if you want to take a fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. These are large scale changes and increases in phenotypic complexity. Well, the problem for them is the genetic data is not on their side, as we just went over a couple lines of evidence that are discriminatory lines of evidence. Evolutionists have no good rescue devices for them. We actually have many points that suggest that the earth and the universe are not old, are not billions of years old. And so now it's like taking a pacifier out of a baby's mouth. Evolution, that would be like time. You remove time from the equation. Now evolutionists are left with only thousands of years to explain the evolutionary story. And so I have entire presentations on the evidence for young earth creation from things like geology and astronomy and so on and so forth. But here's just a couple that I want to focus on. And so out of these here, we got helium diffusion, magnetic field, carbon-14, recession of the moon. I want to focus just on three. And so let's start with helium and zircon crystals. This one is fascinating. When you understand it, it truly is fascinating. So during the process of uranium becoming lead through radioactive decay, helium, which is a gas, is produced. It's a very slippery molecule, and it can move through rocks since rocks are porous. Gas can escape through these rocks. Now, we find rocks that have evidence for what? Uranium, lead, and abundance of helium. Okay. These zircon crystals, they're claimed to be, you can see in the visual, nuclear decay and zircon. They're claimed to be 1 billion plus years old. But is that the case? Well, since we have in these rocks, we have uranium, we have lead and helium. We have an abundance of helium. Okay. If these decay processes have been taking place over long periods of time, let's say hundreds of millions of years, the helium, because it's a slippery molecule, it would have had plenty of time to leak through these rocks. And yet we find a lot of helium in these rocks. And we know from observable evidence, we know the rate as to which helium can move through these rocks. And so over millions of years, based on the known helium diffusion rate, what we would have is the majority of this helium leaking out and escaping into the atmosphere where we shouldn't find it in these zircon crystals. Okay. And so if this helium were created over long periods of time, the helium would be gone because it leaks out so quickly. And so in short, the fact that we find helium in these zircon crystals tells us that they're not hundreds of millions to 1 billion plus years old, or else we shouldn't find the amount of helium that exists in them. Okay, we shouldn't find these rocks comprised of so many helium atoms. And you can read a paper here because you find many old earthers, they'll say, well, what piece of evidence gives us exactly 6,000 to 10,000 years, let's say? Well, based on the rapid rate of helium diffusion, based on the fact that we have these zircon crystals that are claimed to be hundreds of millions of years old, yet we find all this helium that shouldn't be there. Dr. Russell Humphreys, he published a paper here in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, where he said this: though the rocks contain 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay products, newly measured rates of helium loss from zircon show that the helium must have been leaking for what? Only 6,000 plus or minus 2,000 years. That right there is evidence for an earth and a universe that is right where the Bible says, 6 to 10,000 years. Incredible evidence. Next point, C14. Even if every atom in the whole earth, let's say every atom in the universe were radiocarbon, okay, it would have all decayed away in easily 1 million years. And that's probably giving the evolutionists a little too much credit. Probably more like 500,000 years. Okay, now the reason why is this. C14 is a variety of carbon. It has 2 extra neutrons. It's produced in the upper atmosphere due to cosmic ray bombardment. And what that does is you have this bombardment taking place. These cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, and they convert them into C14. C14 will then decay back into nitrogen with a very short half-life. Now, the half-life is 5,700 years. That would be how long it takes basically for half of the C14 to decay back into nitrogen. Now, plants absorb this carbon, right? Since plants take in carbon dioxide and use the carbon to build themselves up, and animals eat plants. We eat animals, we eat plants. And so we're constantly taking in carbon into our bodies, okay? So because we are alive, a small fraction of us is C14. We're radioactive in many ways. But because we are eating plants and eating animals, and animals are eating plants, and plants are taking in C14, we're always replacing that C14 as it decays back into nitrogen. Problem is, when we die, we're no longer replacing the C14 as it decays away. Okay. And so as a result, we can, in some ways, we can use carbon dating to tell how long ago something died. Now, we can make an easy prediction. Okay. Because C14 decays away so quickly at such a short half-life, that means there should be no detectable levels of C14 in any sample that evolutionists would claim are millions to billions of years old. For example, diamonds, the hardest substance on Earth, they're claimed to be billions of years old, created deep within the Earth. Dinosaur fossils, coal, claimed to be millions of years old. There shouldn't be any C14 then, if the Earth really is hundreds of millions to billions of years old. Well, it turns out that when we test samples that evolutionists claim are millions and billions of years old, coal beds, diamonds, dinosaur bones, we get thousands of years when carbon dated. That's because we have C14 present where they shouldn't. Notice this on the slide. We find C14 in coal, C14 in oil, fossil wood, diamonds, basically all throughout the so-called geological column. How is this C14 there if these samples really are millions and billions of years old? Diamonds, they're the hardest substance on Earth. They're resistant to contamination. So that C14 should be intrinsic. A diamond would be, since it's deep down within the rock strata, they'd be shielded by cosmic rays in the atmosphere. There's no new source for C14. And so we shouldn't find the amount of C14 that we do find in these samples. Notice this from geophysicist Dr. John Baumgartner. He says there should be no C14 at all if they really were over 1 billion years old. Yet the Radiocarbon lab reported that there was over 10 times the detection limit. Thus, they had a radiocarbon age far less than 1 million years. Dr. Baumgartner repeated this with 6 more alluvial diamonds, and these had even more radiocarbon. It was a privilege. I got to have Dr. John Baumgartner on the program for a comprehensive seminar where we did at one point get to discuss this. Here are the 2 rescue devices. They don't work. First, they cry, oh, it's contamination. Okay, firstly, these samples, they are subjected to brutal treatments, harsh treatments, and strong acids. Okay, that's what these labs will do. And notice this. And when the instruments are tested with blank samples, they yield 0 radiocarbon. So there can't be any contamination or instrument problems. Another one, they'll say, well, nearby nuclear material can work to recharge the C14. But the RATE team looked at that, radioisotopes in the age of the Earth, several young Earth creationist PhD scientists, and they said that you would need over 15,000 times more nuclear material. Here's another one. New radiocarbon was formed directly in the fossils when nearby decaying uranium bombarded traces of nitrogen in the buried fossils. Dr. Andrew Snelling says, carbon-14 does form from such transformation of nitrogen, but actual calculations demonstrate conclusively this process does not produce the levels of radiocarbon that world-class laboratories have found in fossils, coal, and diamonds. And so you can see here, this is a presentation from Dr. John Baumgartner. This is directly from the secular radiocarbon literature, where you're finding C14, detectable levels of C14 in all these different materials. Here is an analysis that they did on 10 coal samples, finding C14 where they shouldn't find. These are measurements of 6 African diamonds. Results are between 40 times and 300 times the AMS detection limit. I mean, it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. C14 where we shouldn't find it if the earth is old. Helium in zircon crystals, we shouldn't find that. And here's the last one that I want to touch on. We've had entire programs on this, the biological material that we find preserved in dinosaur fossils and dinosaur soft tissues that shouldn't be there if those fossils really are millions of years old. Collagen, for example, we find an abundance of original tissues and original proteins in these dinosaur fossils. And the question for the evolutionists is this: how can you get original tissues and original proteins lasting for millions of years based on what we know about biochemistry? And okay, we are going to transition into Matt's segment now. He is going to discuss more amazing lines of evidence, further confirming exactly what the Bible says, that God created 2 people, Adam from the dust of the ground, Eve from his rib. The book of Genesis makes several genetic statements with significant implications, and the genetic data, the scientific data, has worked powerfully to corroborate its claims.
Donny, I'm not sure if you do this full time or not, but whether or not you do or not, you stay busy, you're doing debates, you're doing all kinds of stuff. So writing books, running your website, running your YouTube channel, all those things. So yeah, it's an honor to have you guys on. So again, thank you. And, whoever is watching or listening, find these guys, Donny Budinsky, Standing for Truth. You can search for that on YouTube or standingfortruthministries.com, right? I think
that's right.
And then, Matt Nailor, he has a channel as well. And you said it was just biblical creation or young earth creation?
Yep, Young Earth Creation.
Young Earth Creation. Search for Young Earth Creation on YouTube, and these guys do a lot of work together. So, they're a good team. So keep doing what you're doing, man. But anybody watching, listening, thanks as always. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening. And as we said earlier, always be able to go out and give a reason for the hope that is in you to whoever asks, and do that lovingly and with reverence for the person you're talking to, love on them and show them why you believe what you believe. So thanks, guys.
God bless.